we all may have ideas about what landscape architecture is, but I'm going to actually share some images with you that are all the work that our students do. Sometimes I like to say that landscape architecture is everything from design of parking lots to national parks. And I've actually, when I was in practice, designed all of those things. Not just parking lots, but the green infrastructure that captures that water and infiltrates it, all the way up to working with the National Park Service on sustainability assessments and sustainability goals. So there's a lot of things we do. Has anyone ever been to the Hudson River Estuary before? Is anyone from the estuary? Hudson River, you're there? It's down by New York City. It basically runs all the way from New York City up to the Adirondacks. It's actually a sub-basin. We might think of it as a watershed kind of conventionally, but it's actually much bigger than a watershed. It's massive. And so all that water drains through there, and I've worked on 5 of the 85 cities in this area. So I want to take a minute and okay, cool. This is a video that we have from one of the design studios where students were looking at existing conditions that are there today and then reconfiguring the grading in order to address acute flooding and how to create wetland spaces and park spaces. So you'll see that we did sort of like a time-stop photography. And so here's with flood coming up. They're actually going to regrade it to see how they can get it to work differently. So I want to talk for a second about climate change. A lot of you know about climate change, probably in great depth, in no small part for the seminar. But there's a bunch of problems that we need to look at with climate change. And I won't go over a lot of the specifics, but the first one is that climate change is coming to every city. It's real, and it's a real issue. The second problem is that climate change is going to radically change how and where cities are going to be in the future. This is something that cities need to be thinking about now. The third problem is that climate change actually is pressing and confusing and hard to get your head around. In some ways, it literally exists there in the atmosphere. And so it's very difficult, first of all, to think about what climate change is, but secondly, how do you react to it? And people are hungry for that, they want to know. And so that's one way we address this third problem or this issue. So you can see here now they're just taking a look at flood elevations, and they use this model to kind of show how that's That was Mark and Ilya. Ilya was at Skate for All, Mark's at Michael Van Valkenburg and Associates in New York City. A lot of you, I wanted to back up for a minute though, a lot of you probably have seen images like this idea that our economy is embedded in our society, and all of our societies are within the planet, right, and within Earth's life support system. This is actually something I pulled from some major resilience theorists, experts, Chapin and Folk, these are some. This is one of the in the introductory chapter describing their notion of resilience and something that they're talking about. I actually dropped back a lot to resilience theory to understand how we can actually act and practice it. And so I also pulled this quote from Chapin et al. Here. I think it was the same chapter, and it says, and this idea that people and environment are inextricably linked from each other inside something called a social-ecological system. So when you look at this quote, we'd understand that the world and our community as a social-ecological system is really composed of two things. People that count on the environment, and the environment has also impacted us by us positively and negatively. All of those things we're influencing each other in that sense. The human side of the world and also the world influencing human society. And so we need to look at how those things interplay. And when we think about resilience, we can start from there. I think actually the sciences already understand this. A number of you are into sciences right now. There's the science of urban ecology. It's a relatively young science. But the notion that it's defined by one of the leaders in urban ecological thinking, by Alberti, is this. It says, it's the study of ways that human and ecological systems evolve together in urbanizing. This is part of how we need to understand how we work and act. And so if it's true that human systems and environmental systems are constantly engaging each other in some kind of ongoing exchange, what does that mean from the standpoint of climate adaptation and climate thinking? We need to be thinking about how we can do that. So I wanted to go through a few definitions about this word resilience. We've been hearing a lot about resilience lately. I bet a lot of you have heard, if you guys heard about it in the last 2 years, someone ever mentioned the word resilience. It's a major hot button word right now. So much, in fact, that I actually wanted to learn more about what its basis was. I started out as an ecologist. I was a threatened and endangered raptor and owl biologist back in the day. And so I had some training in the ecological sciences. I actually had a biology degree. And I became really interested in the fact that the notion of resilience is actually, it's a decades-old concept. There's people who spend their entire careers on resilience theory, and it's grounded in ecological sciences. So there's actually a basis for some of definitions for a number of these terms. So I'm going to just introduce a few that you might see or have seen, and just sort of kind of unpack them a little bit so you can see how that gets us to how we might actually do and act in 2014. The first one is engineering resilience. And that I wrote here, I kind of summarized how those definitions go in this text here. Carl Pope, he actually is talking about the history of resilience and how it came about, this notion of social-ecological systems and social-ecological resilience. The first one he identified was engineering resilience. And that's generally defined as the capacity to resist change and return to a single, stable, equilibrium state. So when I think about that, I think about a city and a river and a levee in between. So there's a city, the levee, and on the other side is the river, okay? If there's a big flood, that flood elevation goes a lot higher in the river. And after that flood's over, the city can go about its business. Nothing has ever changed, right? So it actually is a single state that that city is in, and the levee is in, and the river adjusts, but it can actually resist that change and enter to a single equilibrium state. This actually can be a really useful thing until the levee is breached, and then you have a catastrophic issue at hand. And that's called residual risk. And I won't talk too much about that, but I look at resilience as this being one of those definitions, that notion of engineering resilience. The second one is ecological resilience. And this is about this idea, I wrote on here, sufficient complexity within the ecosystem, and the greater ecology as the term, to reorganize following disturbance so that key functions can be maintained with possible stable equilibria, multiple possible ones. So that sounds kind of complicated, but one way I think about this is I think about pollinators and flowers. What if there's flowers? What if there's a particular species of flower? Pollination is an ecosystem service that pollinators make available in the ecosystem, right? Suppose there are sets of flowers, species of flowers that need to be pollinated in May and June in a particular ecosystem. If there's 5 species of pollinators that are present in the landscape during that time and are available to pollinate that, that's a lot of complexity, and so, or relatively. And if 2 of those species are killed somehow by a disease or is unable to provide that pollination service, there's still 3 more left over, right? And so that notion of complexity is working into the advantage of this particular ecosystem. If there is only 2 pollinators that can provide that pollination in May or June, and 2 species have an illness or disease and they're wiped out, that ecosystem, those pollinators are no longer able to provide that ecosystem service. The thing that ecosystem is counting on is not there. That complexity, or lack of it in the latter case, actually reduces its resilient potential. So greater complexity can lead to greater possibilities for how those services can be. Okay. Any questions about that? The third one is social-ecological resilience. So this actually says, all right, let's think about ecological resilience. Let's build that complexity in there, that potential. And then also bridge some of the great things that people do. Ecosystems don't have memories in the strictest meaning of the term. They don't adapt in the sense of talking amongst one another and working with things. Maybe we can bridge these parent systems to have greater capacity for adaptation, and then also introduce the ability to learn, to reorganize, to remember how things worked or didn't work before, that we can do on the social side, on the people side. We can actually take ourselves as an asset that we bring both from the physical side, on physical and ecological resilience, but also bring social resilience aspects into it. We have the ability to do things that the landscape cannot do on its own. And so it's this notion that we can build the act of building community capacity to adapt to impacts, and building those networks of people around this can result in greater physical and ecological capacity in the landscape. And when that happens, that also provides opportunity for that community to build its capacity. So those two things, that notion of being inextricably linked, we can actually look at how we think about our future from the standpoint of climate adaptation to both change mindsets and also change landscapes. Okay? Any questions about that? That's a fundamental principle that I've based a lot of my own work on, and that really was the birth of the Climate Adaptive Design Studio. This notion that we need to be working with both people and place to inspire change. I'm trained as a designer. I do and make places, right? I work on the design of places and their construction. But also, there are people on that landscape, and if they are also working towards a common goal, we can improve our capacity and our resilience of confronting change. Yeah, Allison.
Go back to the definition.
Sure.
The first definition to me doesn't seem to work that well with climate change and streams, and it's very different from climate adaptation. So it says to resist change and return to a single stable equilibrium, which for the stream will never be the case. So do you use a different definition of resilience that's more attuned to climate change?
Yes. And so I think actually the thing you're calling out is really where I've, is really my point in the sense that I really wanted to move towards a social-ecological resilient state where we can react to the ecosystems to allow them to adapt and adjust, right? And actually work with them to adapt and adjust that physical and ecological capacity. And then we can also build in our capacity as people, our communities, our societies to be ready for that. And so we got to put those two things together. In fact, I work with a lot of municipal clients and many that are within those communities, and they think that the levies could be the answer. In certain cases, that may make sense, but there are costs and risks associated with that that we need to acknowledge and understand that may set up problems down the line. Does that help answer that question? Yeah, and that's particularly true in the studio where I work, where the more I've been working on notions of climate adaptation and resilience, I realized this, I have this thing that I like to say. There's a lot of downtowns that want to move towards their waterfront, right? Property values, growth, scenic, beautiful. But now with climate adaptations, there's a lot of climate change, there's a lot of waterfronts that are wanting to move towards people's downtown. And so you set up this tension, right? And most of my work and the work that I do in my design studio with the students that I work with is really in that contested territory between where the city wants to grow and where the waterfront also is seeking the sea level rise to advance uphill. Okay? And so that's really where our work is. So we've actually worked quite a few years. I started out with a prototype series in fall 2013 and 2014. And for those of you that were assigned the readings or were able to read the readings, this is where my inland adaptation paper started. Before I involved people, that notion on working on the physical and ecological side of adaptation. I'll talk about that in a minute. But also, I found by engaging communities, I could build that social resilience in addition to it. And that's where most of our work has been. This semester in spring 2020, we're not working directly with the community, but we're looking at advancing what we call adaptive technologies, physical technologies, in greater depth. But I'm going to talk mostly about our engaged studios that are working with both people and place. And so my work, like I mentioned, is in the Hudson River Estuary. It really is an amazing place. It's minutes from New York City. There's a rail line that runs all the way up. In 45 minutes, you can be in a very rural area that's beautiful with escarpments and mountains and incredible views of this river that has a long, long history of acknowledging its beauty. and also all kinds of access to New York City all at once. That sets up challenges, right? Because now it's all of a sudden very attractive. It's also a massive river, draining, like I mentioned, all the way from the Adirondacks down. But because it's such a large river, you can go 100, and it's connected to the ocean. It actually experiences tidal fluctuation. You can go 150 miles up the river all the way to the Federal Dam, past Albany and Troy, and actually get 3 or 4 feet of daily tidal fluctuation every day. Okay, and so twice a day you get low tide, and twice a day you get high tide, and that actually happens 150 miles inland. So it's actually pretty amazing. All those 85 cities are situated along the river there, and the train stations are along it that make that possible. So you get this daily tidal fluctuation. Some of the Native American tribes that lived there in years past called the river the Rockatuck, literally the river that flows both ways. Sometimes water's running downstream, and it mostly always is, but when the tide's coming in, it has the appearance of actually running upstream. And so that tidal connectivity sets up for some incredibly dynamic situations. Many of them wonderful on the ecological side, highly valued ecological or wetland estuary. It's a highly valued wetland estuary. It holds freshwater tidal wetlands, which are some of the rarest in the world. And then also it has a strong diversity of other wetland types. And that makes it a fishery, a place where a lot of life is generated and linked to the ocean, where a lot of those species go to spawn, and it's an incredibly diverse area. There's actually seahorses in this place, and that you like way upstream. It's just amazing to actually see. But that also means with this tidal fluctuation that this area is subject to tidal surge and wave run up and other impacts that you might associate with more coastal environments. And I mentioned all the 85 cities there. There's a lot of intensive pressure for development. So now you have these waterfronts wanting to grow. You have these highly sensitive ecological spaces. A lot of these communities are asking for greater access. They want to have access to the water to live in such a great place. And then now you have this, this issue of sea level rise and other storm impacts all colliding along their waterfronts. And so this is really the space that I work. And after years of ignoring the waterfront, a lot of these cities are turning their attention to the waterfront for the economic and recreational opportunity. And this is not unlike many other places in the world. It has a rich history that's really interesting, all the way from dating as back as far as George Washington, but much prior in terms of the people that were living in this area. And so actually, let's So this mixed natural and cultural history often means that you find remnant industry, infrastructure, and other commercial development adjacent to old, low elevation neighborhoods, highly sensitive natural areas, and all of them are impacted by current flooding regimes, and even more to come with sea level rise projections. A lot of what we do is help visualize change in the studio. We actually just used Google Earth on this and found a way to bring our model into it, so that it'd be accessible to all the other cities we work in. This is the city of Kingston, projected at 60 inches of sea level rise. It's actually technically 58 inches if you look at some of the New York State scenarios, but because of the model we had, we had to round up from 6-inch increments. But you can see there's all kinds of places. Here's churches that are at risk in some of these more low elevation neighborhoods, development zones. The blue here is an indication of what that means sea level. It doesn't even take into account some of the storms and floods that you might get, like your 1% storm, or your 100-year storm, or your 2% storm, which is your 50-year event, things like that. And so this collision is what's happening here. But fortunately, many people in the Hudson River Valley already have a strong connection to the river and a sense of community identity. So we can start there. We know what the physical risks are. Let's start talking also about our social assets. And so that helps us provide an inroad to really develop an opportunity for concerted dialogues about how we might have new design features for the city and the waterfront. We worked in 3 parts of Kingston. The this is the rundown as it comes in right here. You guys can see, maybe not. But on the west side we're facing north. North is towards the top of the page. That's the Rondout River there as it enters the Hudson River Estuary. These are 3 areas where we work with them over 3 years with the USDA LEPA grant and some other work, or some other opportunities to work with them through Cornell and Water Resource Institute. And so here's how we work with them. I want to talk a little bit about the structure. I can do this, but I can't do this by myself. Okay, and so we got to find ways to engage communities of people on this. This notion of bringing together city staff, county staff. Actually, we just had a studio where we had state legislators that were present or brought their staff. We also need to get neighbors interested in this. These are people that are actually maybe physically impacted by some of these climate impacts. And as well, we need to be talking to businesses that may be impacted by them, as well as non-NGO organizations, nonprofit organizations. I have my design studio. I talked about that a little bit. The students I find critical. Myself, sure, I'm helpful, but I need to have some people to work with me to help move these ideas forward. And then I have some research fellows and research assistants that work on this. I think we have 4 or 5 of them right now. And so it's a pretty intensive operation. That on top of the fact that I have a key partner in the Department of Environmental Conservation, which is the New York State Natural Resources Agency, for lack of a better term. There's some fantastic people there working in the Hudson River Estuary, and they have a climate outreach program. We also team with Scenic Hudson, which is an organization that is devoted or committed to natural resource protection and scenic protection, but also working with people in these places in ways that seem to be really compatible with us, what we're doing. And then we're also working with cooperative extension when we can have people who know other people there. And so it really has to happen all together with this kind of cooperation. And so the idea behind the studio is to really link our design studio, my design course, if you will, with urban communities, design more connected and resilient waterfront areas. That's the first thing. We also want to combine initiatives for economic growth with climate science to find ways to inspire people to begin acting now. If folks made plans right now and they knew exactly what they want to do, cities this size might take 20, 30, 40 years to do it. So we really want people to get involved with it now, to have those difficult conversations now and begin moving ahead. Part of that means we need to encourage stakeholder interaction and community capacity building for long-term action benefits. And the goal behind the studio really is 3 things. We're seeking what I call the trio of benefits. For this to work, to take the class down and work with the municipality and bring my own goals that I have as someone who's working at the university, it has to be beneficial for the community. It has to be beneficial for the students that are part of this, and it also needs to help move my research forward. So I don't think any one of those is more important than the other. They all need to function together. Students learn cutting-edge climate adaptation strategies and technologies. They also learn to talk about climate change, but also how to adapt with many, many different types of people that we engage. The community gets these products of our work, these alternative design strategies. But I also think equally importantly for them is they get a process to start talking about this and talking with us about it, but perhaps even more importantly, talking amongst themselves about what those issues are and figuring out who has different resources they can bring to the table. And because of our partners in DC and others, they can have access to this ongoing technical assistance. So we talked about this duality in social-ecological systems. And so I wanted to share with you a little bit about what we do with stakeholder engagement. We actually have a way of sort of figuring out how we can work with many different people at once. We want to attract as broad a body of individuals as possible to this because different people bring different knowledge, different expertise. I may have some climate knowledge that I can bring to the table, but people that are working and living in that city, they're the experts of that city. We need their expertise as well. So, and that same goes also for businesses and those that are there. So you can look at capacity building theory. One One area that you might be interested in looking at is understanding principle of ways to connect people around a topic. And so what we've done here, our approach has been to basically make a matrix: public, private, nonprofit, academic, and media sectors. So there's sectors across the top. And then we also look at scales of influence or scales of power, all the way from the folks that are at the grassroots, down at the bottom of the page, maybe they ought to be at the top, and then all the way up to some of the higher levels of engagement in their community or their agency. And so you can take a look at private or public's property. Down at the bottom left here, you may have people that are city staff. The next one up in scales of power and influence are county level administrators, right? Maybe all the way up to state or federal. You can actually look at all these different sectors and realize different people bring different strengths. So I mentioned bonding, bridging, and linking. If you're interested in this idea about getting people to engage and maximizing that capacity building, you can look at an article by Harrison et al. And in that article, they talk about bonding that happens. I thought I would have my little pen here to be able to circle it. But imagine one of these squares in here. Bonding happens when people that are in the same sector and scale of power actually get to talk with themselves. Bonding happens all the time. If you have fellow student friends, you're talking with each other, you're bonding, right? Bridging is actually engaging people that are in a different sector than you. That's a different kind of interaction, right? I'm in the nonprofit sector, and now I'm talking to somebody who's working at a county agency. That's bridging that's happening there. Linking is actually the setting up of relationships between the same sector, but at different levels. So maybe you have a city staff member talking to a federal agency, someone who's a staff member there, and that's called linking relationship. All of those relationships bring different dynamics and different opportunities to the table. Maybe there's a federal grant available, and there's a county person or a city person which has a good project idea. Those kinds of conversations can happen. So we talk about building that capacity. And so the result of that is an intensive set of interactions where these opportunities are able to come to the fore. Any questions about that? There's a lot of kind of approach in there thematically. I also want to spend a minute talking about building physical and ecological capacity. What I just talked about with bonding, bridging, and linking, and some of that adaptive capacity building is that second paper that was in the conference proceedings that those of you that read it could look at. This one actually is based on the adaptation paper that I mentioned before. And this came out of this notion that when I was here for Hurricanes Irene and Lee in particular, I found incredible amounts of damage happening inland here. And it wasn't just flooding. There are all kinds of other issues that came up. And I began realizing that climate change is complicated. There are many, many impacts of climate change. Designers ought to be thinking about many, many opportunities to adapt, be thinking more comprehensively about how we adapt, not just focusing on one impact, but looking at many. So we, in the studio, a lot of our adaptation strategies are based on are grounded in these three physical areas for the physical and ecological capacity. One is water system support, the second is ecosystem support, and the third one is support for the built environment. So we look at those impacts, or projections, then we understand what those impacts might be. And then we build it looks like there's a typo there, if you can find it. Then we build adaptation responses into it that are also comprehensive. So what are the design strategies we look at? I've got them listed on the far right here. That's probably the most important for the purpose of this talk to spend time talking about with you or to be looking at. And I'm just going to go over a few of them really quickly. On the water system side, we talk about floodable landscapes. We actually can design spaces not only by their uses, but also how they're graded in the infrastructure and material that's in there to allow them to recover after a flood. Maybe that means that we don't put a police station in a landscape that's in a flood. We might want to put something like a floodable park or a floodable amphitheater or a parking lot that can recover quickly. Okay. That's one physical strategy or physical or ecological capacity building strategy. It goes on in addition to the social resilience building that's happening amongst the community. The second one is green infrastructure. I've become really interested in how, do you guys know what green infrastructure is? And maybe I'm just assuming too much. A lot of what we've done is spend incredible amounts of dollars figuring out how to get water off of our site. And that's really important if you're driving and you're in a city and you're on the road. The rain comes down, water lands on your impervious surface, your roadway. And what we've done through some pretty actually ingenious engineering, we figured out how to grade that road and get that water to come off and go into a pipe and go into a sewer system. Which, where does it go? Where does it go once it's in the sewer system? Probably goes to a river. And that river is impacted not only by that new influx of water, but also all the stuff that gets carried with it. We think a lot about road salt right now, there's tons of it, but also the greases and the oils and the other things that weaken the resilience or the capacity for that ecosystem, because that can be very harmful. That compounds things when in fact you also have your water, your storm water piping going into your sewer water piping. Does everyone know what I mean by sewer water? The sanitary water, the stuff that happens when you flush your toilet, right? All that has its own pipe network. Now, if we have an overloaded pipe network that carries our sanitary water, our cities are growing, we have not enough capacity to handle all that and get into the wastewater treatment plant. When that storm water comes in, it actually doesn't make it to the wastewater treatment plant. It actually daylights and floods, and it's sort of an emergency off-ramp into these streams. And so green infrastructure says, hey, look, that's having huge impacts on our own quality of life, because that's our stream that's next door to us, but it's also not good for the ecosystem. So what we actually can do with green infrastructure is to intercept that water off the road before it enters the pipe and put it into a swale or a rain garden or some depression that allows that water to infiltrate. So we could be talking about green infrastructure for today and how to size that and calculate what those volumes need to be for that stormwater swale. But we know with climate change that there's going to be more extreme precipitation, more water entering the site in a shorter amount of time. And that actually changes that calculation for that swale, that bioswale, that infiltration factor. And so what that means is that we need to be calculating that differently and thinking differently about how it performs. So that's a technology that we've been developing and interested in moving forward. Here's another adaptation approach. I mentioned wetlands, right? There's a lot of wetlands in the Hudson River Estuary. And marsh, in this, just because it's an alliteration thing, people talk about marsh migration. We know where those wetlands are today, where those marshes are today. Wetlands, unfortunately, well, not unfortunately, wetlands, as the case may be, there's many different types of them. And a lot of the types of wetlands are dependent on what's called the hydrologic depth, how deep the water is in that wetland, right? And so you have some wetlands that really like it in shallow water, different plant communities and wildlife that can survive there. And you have other wetlands that have that are relatively deep, and different plant communities and different wildlife can survive there. Now imagine that if you have sea level rise, that's adding to the water column, right? An area that once was this deep, now is this deep. And so the plant community that was adapted to living here can't live here. It actually has to go uphill to find that equivalent water depth. And that that wetland type that liked water this deep now has to also move up and find that appropriate water depth, because sea level rise is continuing to add to that depth. And so what you see in the landscape is over time a migration of those wetland types uphill. And so we need to be able to be prepared for that, to understand the vital resource that those wetlands bring, the fisheries and the greater ecology of the Hudson River Estuary and many other places that people live and we may be working. We need to look at ways to remove some of those barriers to allow that marsh migration to happen, or else find ways where that can be more compatible on the waterfronts. And so that's a different technique, a design technique that we can use. The third one is resilient planting design, acknowledging that there's going to be some changes in our climate. Some plants are going to do well, some may not do well. And so when we design a place, we're really interested in that sticking around. We put a street tree in, we want it to work for both today, but also in 40 years. Or we have a plant community we want to add. We also want it to be compatible. We can actually use principles of ecological resilience, like I was talking about earlier, to add complexity to our planting strategies using techniques such as plasticity, functional redundancy and response diversity that I'm not going to get into right now, but you'll see covered in that inland adaptation paper. That's a technological or a technique approach where we can begin adapting physically. I don't know if you guys have heard about urban heat island mitigation. Ever heard that? Some of us. This notion that cities, because there's so much hardscape and less vegetated area, actually get hotter than the areas that are next to them. All that solar heat, solar energy, solar light is absorbed by those hardscapes and re-emitted as infrared or heat, actually raising significantly the temperature in cities. We've lost a lot of vegetation in cities. Cities are figuring out that actually makes their city hotter. And so maybe we can be thinking about planting design strategies that actually increase shade, improve evapotranspiration. You may hear about cool roofs or other things in this seminar later about what you do on the architectural side to really reduce that urban environment impact. And that's a technology that we can use or a technique that we can use. I'm only going to talk about a couple more of these. Multimodal mobility, this idea that we can encourage more types of transportation that are, some of which are not carbon dependent or depend less on fossil fuels to get you there, right? So we can walk, and we can bike, and we can take the train. We can also drive. But some of those techniques are much more efficient in terms of use of fossil fuels and energy. And so that's something you can encourage. This transit-oriented development is a term you may hear urban designers or landscape architects use. And this is, I think, part of a palette of adaptive strategies. The last sort of physical technology I want to show you, or physical technique, is flood-proof structures. We certainly don't encourage building in the floodplain, or even the future floodplain, if you think about it. If we know the floodplain, if the sea level rise is going to advance uphill, maybe we ought to think about what kind of future we want in that area, whether you're the owner, or the city, or someone who may be living there. But some places are already built in areas that are susceptible or will be susceptible soon. And there's different discrete techniques you can use to reduce the impact of flooding. One of my favorite places to go is a barbecue that's actually in Kingston. It's a barbecue restaurant. I like that just because of that, but also because they've done some pretty amazing things to adapt their building to the flood scenario that they're currently experiencing. When Sandy came, it actually filled up almost all the first floor of that restaurant. So they figured out pretty quickly, maybe we can do something about this, rebuild later, or let's adapt our building. The first one is take your utilities, move them upstairs. Take your electrical plugs and sockets. There's one right here. Just 1.5 feet off the ground if you're at floor level. If you get an 8-foot flood, that's going to get knocked out. So one thing you can do pretty simply is just take your electric outlets, put them up higher. So when the water receives, they're not damaged. Not complicated. Another thing they've done, which is actually really interesting, is they've regraded their first floor. So when it fills up with water, they just open the doors up after the flood's over and the water drains out. And they've added passive heating through pipes into the floors to create radiant floors. They heat it up, and within 24 hours after the most recent flood, they actually were up and had accepting customers. So there's things you can do also on the architectural retrofit side. That's a set of different approaches. So I'm talking about things we can do about building community capacity and social capacity, right? And then also some of these physical things we can introduce. And that's really what we've done. This act of working with people to talk about these options is really what the Climate Adaptive Design Studio does. And so there's 5 basic principles I wanted to share with you that we've learned now. We work with 5 cities. I can't say we've done it all, but we do have some ideas about what cities are interested in, at least in this region. And maybe they'd be of interest to you and where you live too. I don't have much time to share these, but I just wanted to kind of open the floor on how you might think about being adaptive at a waterfront level. They're not complicated, but I do think they're important. The first is that if you're going to design a waterfront. Design a place that actually benefits from being near the water. Did any of you grow up in a waterfront towns or cities that have riverfront or oceanfront? Yeah. How many of you have seen parking lots that butt up right against the river or the ocean? or, yeah, for sure. Or other things, or garage, or something that doesn't necessarily benefit from being on the water. More and more people want to move towards the waterfront. We ought to be finding ways for the kinds of interventions we design and build to actually benefit from that waterfront location. So we're always looking for ways to design a waterfront that maximizes what a waterfront can be. And that means thinking more about water-dependent uses that we can put down towards the water versus the water-independent uses, okay? There's also water-enhanced uses like a restaurant. Again, we got to stay out of the floodplain and other things, but if you're going to be pretty close to the water, this is something you can be thinking about. Design a waterfront. The second one is design for flooding. We talked about this in a number of physical capacities before when I was talking about the physical side. This notion of designing for flooding, maybe working with water is better than working against it. And this gets at a little bit maybe what Allison, you were talking about as well. This notion of perhaps levees aren't always, trying to force the river to do something is maybe not what we want to do. Maybe we want to work with water. There will be cases when we have very, very high value assets where we may need to consider levees and other things, but we also need to consider those risks. And so when we design for flooding, we can understand strategies for reinforcement, sure, if needed. Adaptation, this idea that we can work with water to allow our landscapes to flood or our buildings to flood and then recover quickly. That's what's called adaptation. Another one is strategic relocation. Perhaps a use that's currently on the waterfront now doesn't have a bright future there. Perhaps there's a way to find a place that allows that use to continue to thrive in the city, but maybe not right there at the water. So that's called strategic adaptation, or strategic relocation. And so we can select choices that minimize risk while optimizing benefits. And we can emphasize those flood-adapted uses that I talked about, as well as, if need be, not everyone wants to move away from the waterfront, but it may be something that an owner or a municipality can consider. The third one is design for community. Really what this should be, and actually I need to change this slide, because we actually talk about designing with community. That's this whole notion that we adopt in the Climate Adaptive Design Studio. We invite, or they invite us down. We go down and meet them down there. We talk about what their concerns and risks, their concerns are about climate change. We also talk about what their vision is. We go back into the design studio, develop some early ideas about what they could be doing with their waterfront, and then go back down again to have a workshop with them and talk about stuff we missed, stuff we did, stuff that they would like to see, things that we haven't thought of, maybe we don't know of something in a particular area. And then finally we share that work in an open house with set, and all of those are different kinds of conversations that we have with them and they have amongst themselves. And so one thing that we found is that in designing with community, many people really want their waterfront to be accessible to all their citizens, right? Some people own waterfront property. That's one way of getting access, but there's a lot of people that can't or don't own waterfront property. But they also see the value of being near the water, whether it's for recreation, for quality of life, or other things. And so finding ways to work that out is important. This also gets at this notion that this waterfront must participate with the city. It must be a memorable and wonderful place that contributes to its identity. I think that's also important. The fourth one is five total. The fourth one is design with nature. This idea that a healthy Hudson is good for the people living there, but also for the greater ecology. This notion that working ecosystems contribute to better cultural systems and more effective cultural systems. People in the Hudson identify with their river. We need to find ways to work with nature. So I talked about building a healthy estuary by maintaining and creating important terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems. I mentioned marsh migration. Also helping habitat work for us. Ecosystems provide things called ecosystem services, which I don't have a whole lot of time to talk about right now, but is this notion of pollination services that I brought up earlier in the presentation. That's a service that an ecosystem provides. There are many other services that they provide, like flood attenuation and other things, water absorption and other things. And so by working with ecosystems, they can also, those habitats can work for us as well. And living shorelines and aquatic and terrestrial connectivity, a number of other things that we look at are part of it, this notion of designing with nature, marsh migration and other things. Finally, this landscape, the waterfronts, city that's here, the water that's here, this area is changing rapidly. It's changing in terms of the growth and the ecosystem sensitivity, but it's also going to be changing more and more with a greater likelihood of flooding and ultimately inundation and rising sea levels. So we need to design for change. And this is actually really important for cities. Cities that are 250,000 and below, we have great examples of multi-tens of million population cities about how they can adapt. Some of those cities are so large that when they make a choice, they can change tomorrow, right? Cities that are really small, like 250,000 people or below, those ideas that we talk about or they decide to move forward with as we work with them actually take quite a long time to implement. So we need to find ways to phase adaptation strategies into the process, okay? And one way that we can do that is to think about what early wins can we have early in their adaptation plan and ones that take considerably longer to keep working on those and find the funding and those kinds of things. Also, waterfronts need to be assets to cities at all times. The people that live in cities want their cities to be great. They want their waterfront to be a contributor to that, both today, whether that's for business, economy, access, recreation, but it also needs to be useful tomorrow. So we can't think about how it's going to look just in 2080. We can't think about how it's just going to look in 2020. We need to have it be successful for the city every step of the way. Often in design studios, you come up with a final design, and so students come into my studio thinking they're going to design one project. They're actually going to design 5 projects. We take a look at the 2020 stamp, the 2050 stamp, the 2080 stamp, and maybe some in between, figure out how it's going to transition and still be a working asset. So that phasing is really critical. Any questions? You said you wanted about 10 minutes for questions later. 5 minutes? I'll skip one slide. That's fine. So the CAD studio, the Climate Adaptive Design Studio, our role is really about inspiring people to act, to change. Maybe this negative thing about climate change could actually turn into a positive if we talk about possible futures for these cities, things that they can get excited about to help them get where they want to go and also take into account these climate issues. So that's important. This inspiration is important. That studio is only 16 weeks long. And this is a city that's been around for tens of years before, decades, and hopefully will be many, many decades beyond. And so by working with a partner like the DEC, they're working on the front end to get people interested in this idea. We begin working with them to get design ideas going, those products that we create in this process to kickstart some of that community capacity building and conversation that allows them to integrate and move towards action in the future once our studio is gone. I go back a lot too, but we have key partners on the ground that are helping there to help them find the funding they need and other things, and design professionals they need to move this forward. So we want to be catalytic. We want to help turn the corner between interest to action. That's our goal. And so, how do we know what's working? How do we know what we're doing is working? I think what we need to do is evaluate ourselves. So that's really important. How can we evaluate how we're doing? Well, recently we've had 2 people submit for national level awards for our design studio. The work that's been done in this studio course, and one of them received a national ASLA honor award. That's the premier professional organization, the American Society of Landscape Architects. That's a sign. We think engaged design is good design. Working with communities about ideas that are good for them, and also believing that also can be good design outcomes that make sense to the design community as well. That can lead to better outcomes. Engaged design is good design that can lead to better outcomes, both for the communities, but also what is effective in design. And part of that comes from the act of discovery together, participating together to figure out what the issues are and the opportunities and how to put those together. So we're thrilled to get that. I'm not going to talk too long about this, but I want to know how we're doing. So we actually, in working with Shorna Allred and Todd Walter, that's not either of them, we actually asked students, how are we doing? Sure, we get a student survey at the end of the year, but we want to know more. How effective is this for you, for your learning, for your ability to work with other people and talking about the value of your ideas. We also work with the watershed engineering group. How the nature of that interaction of this cross-disciplinary engineering and landscape architecture works. We have meetings to talk about that. We also work with as the community. We have meeting surveys with the communities as well and say, how are we doing? Is this helping you get to where you want to go? And then actually interviewing people at length afterward. And then we also interview ourselves. If you want to know if you're successful, you really got to figure it out. And so we're trying to do that along those three benefits: community, teaching, and research benefits. And so we talk about that, and we've got some really interesting and valuable results to help us move forward. Another way we look at it is through our metrics. And this is on the community side. We've had these are actually dated numbers. But over the last 7 studios, we've had over 1,400 contact hours working with these cities, probably more now. And because of the successes that we were seeing, the DEC, the Department of Environmental Conservation, put out an RFP and said, you municipalities that have been working with the Climate Adaptive Design Studio, you put forward that effort, we invite you to find a landscape architecture or design firm to actually apply for an RFP, a request for proposals, to be awarded grant funding to move it forward. You invest the time, we'll invest in you moving forward with some of these ideas. And on top of that, so over $250,000 was awarded to cities we worked with. But on top of that, of the cities that we worked with, those that put our work or referenced our work in award proposals have been awarded over $11.8 million in funding. That's just in the last 3 years. Now, to be fair, one of those cities got $10 million, so that really kind of ups the ante. But in 3 short years, we've been able to get some of these cities toward a more adaptive future and developing the ideas that they started to find interest in through the studio, and plenty of other interests beyond. So I guess in closing, because we want to save some time for questions, I think our work in cities is both ecologically and socially linked, and we really got to work with both. If we're only working with the physical stuff, we're only using half of the tools and resources and opportunities at our disposal. So we really need to be working with people and the physical landscape when we talk about resilience or climate adaptation. Process and product. I talked about some of these alternative design strategies we share with our citizens, the community members we work with, but also we can enhance the impact of our products, right? Secondly, I think those processes of getting folks to talk with us and also amongst themselves can enhance our impact by involving citizens and community members and stakeholders in the design of their great places. Progress takes time. We really need to begin planning and designing for change now so that these ideas can be implemented over the long term. Have the difficult conversations now. If you haven't in 30 years, that's too late. We need to be having the tough conversations now in order to be able to plan ahead at understanding some of the projected impacts that are before us. We also talk about every project is an opportunity to work towards a more adaptive future. And I think that means the adaptive future is an opportunity to work to improve quality of life for people, but also the quality of those ecosystems. And I view every project as an opportunity for that, and that's important. And so really, this is up to us, and this is where we stand. It's about building a culture of adaptation. It's also about designing physical spaces, but it's also about building a culture of adaptation. And climate change is not a spectator sport for anybody. And so designers are makers, and we feel now is our chance to make history with our partners by refusing to accept an ending not of our own choices. Let's be active in our future. Let's find a way where we can work together and participate collectively towards better outcomes and futures ahead of us. So that's all I have to say. If you're interested in learning more about the program, there's a website there. If you have any questions, please email me. I look forward to it. Thank you.
Great. So would you like to pass around the mic?
Hi, So you focused on waterfront a lot in this lecture. What are some other important aspects that communities value, or you guys have to take into consideration when designing?
Yeah, not just waterfronts, you're saying, what else can we do? A couple of them I pointed out, because I think with urban heat islands, for example, this notion that cities are hotter, it can be hotter anywhere. They don't need to be hotter at the waterfront. In fact, in some cases, being near the water actually might help cool. Places that lack that water and vegetation, more inland, those are the ones that can really be at great risk for those temperature fluctuations. I was working on a project in Cairo, Egypt a couple of years ago, and already they have summers where it's 16 degrees consistently in the summers. Well, that's a very susceptible non-waterfront location. Cairo's near the Nile, of course, but there's non-waterfront locations that are highly susceptible already. And if we're adding temperature later, that's going to be a bigger issue. I mentioned earlier the impacts of Irene and Lee on our local area here. We had hundreds of millions of dollars of damage from these hurricanes that were nowhere near the water. They were actually in places not too unlike Ithaca. They were subject to surface flooding or watershed flooding. It really is water, the streams and rivers that were there really weren't a major part of their city, but because they were at towards the base of that watershed, if you will, all that water with all that engineering and piping quickly moved it onto their city property. And so we need to be thinking ahead on ways to deal with that. Some of those things we can do have to do with green infrastructure, but also looking up in our watershed and understanding how quickly water moves and finding ways to help slow it down. Good question.
So my question is, what other sources of funding is required for your work? Roughly around how long does it take for you?
Yeah. Sources for me or sources for our partners, I guess. Okay, yeah. Well, you know, it's really interesting. In New York State, there's a lot of money for climate adaptation, development, and implementation. But not a lot of people are using it right now. There's incredible state funding right now. And then also at the state level. And then through the Department of State and others. But also there's funding in DDC. Those are two agencies, Department of Environmental Conservation. But also there's funding at the federal level through other programs. And so if you're interested in ways that communities can benefit, I can send out a link. We're just about to, we have a whole list of other funding opportunities that are there, whether at the state level or the federal level or even other levels from other organizations. So that's a good question. I think that one thing we do is maybe something that others would like to have, this ability to unlock interest in moving forward. I find that to be a barrier and also an incredible opportunity to transcend. And so I'm always looking for other sources as well. Good question. If you think of any others, well, please let me know, okay? Because I'm trying to. Good.
Hello.
Yes.
So earlier in the talk, you were talking about the bond, bridge, and link relationship.
Yeah.
And so I was wondering if there's, within those same relationships, are there ways in which they can antagonize each other and if that can disrupt the green infrastructure?
Right. Well, I think you asked a really important question, and I have been in the room when some of the conflicts you might imagine in your own mind's eye have happened. And it's one thing that we try to do. I tend to believe that we need to start having, like I was saying, the difficult questions now, difficult conversations now. One thing we do is we try to set up ground rules. I think most people that come to work with us have interests in mind that are consistent with maybe goals that we might see for them. But because we try to invite as diverse a set of stakeholders as possible, that's not always the case. And so we need to talk about developing a spirit of collaboration and constructive discussion to help move forward. And so sometimes people don't want to talk about climate change, but they are interested in the vision for their city. And so we start there and find ways to put those two things together. It can be really challenging, but those moments can also become really rewarding if people find goals in common or things that they can work with to move forward. Because literally we're all in that same space, that same contested territory. So let's find a way to move them. That's a great question. I think about it every day. Yes?
In your Google Earth animation, you mentioned that it was about 60 years in the future. Do you ever predict sea levels farther into the future and then design areas for more long-term solutions?
Right, good question. So Well, I can tell you this, that without getting too far into it, and you may hear from other experts in this area on climate change projections. Have you had any climate change projection experts talk at the seminar yet? It's early in the semester. There are different projections out there depending on what happens in the world, right? Whether all countries decide to work together to reduce carbon emissions. That's going to result in a different scenario than if all of them ignore it. Disease, war, economic growth, change, cultural changes. All of those things influence possible alternative futures or outcomes for sea level rise, right? More or less greenhouse gases going into the atmosphere, depending on all of those factors. And so New York State and ourselves, we actually look at, there's a low impact scenario, a medium impact scenario, and a high scenario. There's actually a lot of them kind of grouped together. We use what's called the high scenario, which is sort of the worst case, which seems to be where things kind of are going at the moment. And we use that high scenario, and then in order to think out ahead with projections, we have to use projections that other people generate, because we're not those kinds of technical experts or climate experts. But we also look for 2080 as a place where most people, many people, particularly those of you in the room, many of you in the room, can imagine being around for that. And so that brings a tangibility to it. There are certainly projections that go out to 2100 that the state of New York has also been looking at and building ideas off of. I'm not a climate expert to know how reliable those projections get out the farther and farther you go. And so I think that that's also a factor. Yes?
Hi, thank you for your presentation, by the way.
Thank you.
So you mentioned that there were a lot of difficulties with community engagement, and I know down in New York City with the East Side Coast Resiliency Project, the community does express backlash in terms of the floodplain protection initiative does come at the expense of their park. So I was wondering if in any of your previous projects, have you ever dealt with the community being like against designing waterfront floodplain protection because it comes at expense of a community service like a park or something?
Well, that's exactly the conversations we have. And so one thing I can say is that it's really not us. Park is projected to go underwater over time. So it's something that's sort of not in our hand. We're looking for ways to make that park or those opportunities last in as much the greatest way possible, whether it's on that site or somewhere else. But I'll tell you, there have been conversations with folks where they're like, I don't understand this. How do I do this? But what we would do is we always start with what those projections are and make sure people understand what they are. And it's actually really amazing. We've had cases where you can imagine a scenario where maybe there is someone who owns property who wants to develop it, but there's a concern about it going underwater. But by engaging different people from different stakeholder backgrounds, perhaps a land trust could come and help them find ways where they can work with different strategies. And so all of those conversations are kinds of we have. I can tell you we're at time, but if you have any more questions about how we engage these strategies, I would encourage you to take a look at a couple of those papers that I shared, particularly the Environmental Design Research Association paper, and then also if you have any other questions or want to talk to me about what this all could mean, please contact me. Really good question. I know we're rolling.
There's one more question. Why don't you come up and ask it up front? And the word for today is resilience.